Good morning, everyone, and welcome to BusinessWorld Insights, the first session of a special two-part series on Philippine startups moving forward and up. My name is Santiago Arnaiz, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's discussion on how innovators and incumbents work together to co-create the future of our business world. As we saw in PwC's recent Philippine Startup Survey, global investors are showing a lot of interest in the Philippines and its rising startup ecosystem. The COVID-19 crisis has truly highlighted the value of Philippine startups in providing fresh and impactful solutions, and moreover, in contributing to economic recovery. And incumbents have thrown their hats in as well, supporting these innovators not only as investors, but as meaningful collaborators. So, through these collaborations, enterprises and startups are grabbing opportunities to boost one another in fascinating and exciting new ways. So, today, we're joined by some of the most sought after personalities in the country's startup scene. We'll be hearing from each speaker in turn and before diving into a free flowing panel conversation. Before we call them on screen, though, just a reminder to our audience that we'll be taking audience questions later during the Q&A. So be sure to send them in the comments section, which our team will be monitoring. Now, without further ado, let's jump right in with our guests for today. Our first speaker, with over 30 years of marketing experience across key industries, is Joaquin John L. San Agustin. He's the Senior Vice President of Marketing of SM Supermalls. As the marketing head of SM Supermalls, he oversees digital, advertising, corporate marketing, media, mall marketing, and crisis management. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. Joaquin L. San Agustin. John, you have the screen.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning, Thiago, and good morning to everyone. SM started as an MSME, which in today's parlance is a startup, when Mr. C. Sr. opened Shoe Mart in Carriedo in 1959. When he started, he, like many of the startups today, had a hard time getting big businesses and banks to support him when he needed to scale up. And that is why he put up a bank in the early 1960s, the Acme Bank, whose goal was to help small businesses like his. So really, MSMEs and our love for MSMEs or startups is in our DNA. When Mr. C moved beyond the department store into mall development, he also looked for those businesses who were small and wanted to grow. Brands such as Lydia's Lechon, Bench, Max's, Jollibee, all these were small brands who he convinced to put up shop in his malls so that they could grow together. And what success they have become. So it is indeed, for SM at least, a synergistic partnership we have with startups and MSMEs. As they grow, so do we. As a matter of fact, out of over 20,000 tenant partners in our malls, 15,000 plus of them are MSMEs. We have so many amazing stories to tell about these brands that grew from kiosks to multiple stores to a shop in every one of our 79 malls. And how did we grow to 79? Through the support of these startups or MSMEs, who are both our national partners and homegrown. We have small popular brands such as Viscos, known for their strawberry shortcake in Baguio, and Rib Shack, a barbecue stand in Bacolod, that have expanded. Viscos is now even in Mega Mall and in Pangasinan, while Rib Shack has 15 restaurants in the Visayas and Mindanao. During the pandemic, they were one of the first that we gave rental relief and helped in their vaccination drive to ensure their employees were 100% vaccinated so they could restart sooner than later. And late last year, we started a project called the Startup Market, where we chose 100 purely digital MSMEs or startups and gave them prime space in 13 of our premier and regional malls to help them get a footing in an on-ground space. We gave them a favorable rental scheme and assistance with marketing, signages, free kiosks, and access to BDO NetBank. Today, many of them have actually moved on and are now moving up to permanent inline spaces since they did well in our startup markets. These tenants include the Truffle Peddler, Bev's Handicrafts, Shina's Homemade Products, Hamora's Cochina, Katipuneras PH, Roos Oven, Magic Scoops, the famous Taiwan pepper bun, Gats, premium egg tarts, and over 15 other MSMEs across the 13 participating malls. SM would not be where it is today without startups or MSMEs, and we shall continue to commit to the growth of these startups in every way that we can help. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'd love to dive a bit more into how startups play a role in the not in even the DNA of SM in the panel discussion later. Now, our second speaker today joining us is a digital venture builder, investor, and one of the top fintech influencers in the country today. He's the CEO and managing director at FDev, the venture investment and incubation unit of the Philinvest group of companies, one of the largest conglomerates in the Philippines. He's also currently a startup mentor for Endeavor Philippines and Plug and Play APAC. Please welcome Mr. Xavier Marzan. Xavier, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here.
So, Xavier, happy to hear from you in your opening statements.
Awesome. Yeah, so we'll just quickly walk through who we are, what we do, and how we've been working with startups since inception, actually, a couple of years ago, right? So, again, we're FDev, that's short for Function Dev, and we're essentially that venture studio or venture arm of the Philinvest group of companies. And what we do is we invest in and incubate startups that tap what we consider to be massively underserved segments in the Philippines. So we're an organization that's made up of ex-startup founders ourselves, product guys, data mavens, engineers, designers, digital transformation experts, and we all work together to essentially future-proof the entire conglomerate, and actually more in terms of contributing to digitally transforming the Philippines, as well as helping drive the startup ecosystem. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're backed by the Philinvest Group. And as a group, we've traditionally been in a lot of old economy sectors: real estate, banking and finance, hospitality, and leisure, retail. We even have agriculture, power, infrastructure, etc. But the last couple of years, we've been investing in a lot more technology-driven initiatives, and we'll quickly walk you through how we've worked with tech startups in most cases. So FDev has actually only been in, we were birthed 2 years ago, so we're very much a pandemic and lockdown company. Next slide, please. So when we think about our work with startups, we actually look at these three spheres, right? Like, one is disrupting ourselves from the outside, which means incubating and running after a lot of these new technology driven business models and startups as well. And I'll give a few examples in a bit. Second sphere is looking at how we can accelerate digital transformation of our existing core companies. And what we do there is connect a lot of the startups, both locally and globally as well, with our operating units, and to help them accelerate their own digital transformation journeys. And the third sphere that we look at is people transformation. So we also tap the insights and perspectives and essentially how startups work, right, to attack certain opportunities, and find ways to infuse that in our broader organization. So in the next slide, just talking about venture building and venture investing as well. So we not only deploy funding and capital to interesting startups, we also incubate and build out startups ourselves when we see specific opportunities that are underserved. And in the next slide, I'll show a few examples of some of the startups within the group that we actually help support um, their launch during the last, call it 12 to 18 months, right? So we're into digital banking. We have Como. Investry is an SME crowdfunding platform focused on financing SMEs and startups as well. Quote is a B2B e-commerce platform. Fastwire is more on business to business fintech, providing solutions to make operations of businesses more efficient. And we've even delved into cloud kitchens and trying to redesign the whole like experience of um, buying food for many people online. So that's the first sphere. The second sphere, as I talked about earlier, we're also, and in the next slide, we'll see that we're continuing to invest in existing and new sectors. So we're investing in the future of banking and finance. We're very much into fintech and e-commerce. We're also investing in the future of real estate in cities, right? And then we're also looking at new sectors, including Web3 and blockchain. And what we want to do is drive a lot of these innovations towards, very traditional industry sectors as well. In the next slide, I mentioned earlier that we also help connect startups with our operating companies. So as you can see here, over the course of the last 12 to 18 months, right, we've also had a lot of experience working with tech startups, both locally as well as regionally, globally, and having them work very closely with some of our operating companies. So you can see a few prop tech startups here, which work with our real estate units. You can see a lot of fintech and banking related startups, Brancas, Sendit, which work with a lot of our companies, particularly the bank as well. And we have a few others that are covering many different aspects of our different industry sectors. And then lastly, in the next slide, we also tap the experience and ways of working, essentially the culture of startups, and see how they can influence our own people within the organization, right? So we definitely believe that um, digital transformation is very much focused on people and leadership transformation as well. And so we realize that a lot of the values and culture that startups actually leverage on today are also very applicable and should be applicable to large enterprises as well. So again, just to wrap it up in the next slide, we're very much involved in working with startups. Again, we do create startups ourselves and help scale them up. We provide investing as well, deploy capital to startups with an interesting business model. And then we push open innovation within our organization by helping accelerate our own digital transformation initiatives by having the operating companies work with external startups, both internationally and locally as well. Yeah, so looking forward to working with everyone to help build the future and help drive the startup ecosystem.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Xavier. I find the venture studio model so fascinating. I'd love to dive into exactly how that might work and what the experience of a startup coming up in your environment, in the venture builder environment, would look like later during the Q&A.
Definitely.
So,
Thank you.
rounding out our panel today is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Grocery. Having worked in Singapore for Procter & Gamble, the Boston Consulting Group, and Unilever, he has vast professional experience working across various retail distribution channels, specifically focusing on sari-sari stores as a pivotal channel in Philippine retail, the national economy, and in society at large. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Raymond Roland, ER. Welcome to the screen.
Hey, Tiago. Good morning. Lovely to have me today. Um, Maybe for my limited time, I'll cover a few things. I'll talk about who we are as a company, Grocery, how we've been the recipient of the help of big companies that our two former speakers have mentioned, and how even as a company, as a startup company, we're also helping give back some value to some of the big companies in the Philippines. For some of you who don't know, Grocery is a company that aims at empowering MSMEs, more specifically sari-sari stores in the Philippines, connecting them to companies directly, giving them access to better prices, to products, so that they can increase their ability to earn, but also solve a lot of the logistics pain points that they are experiencing today. Tiago mentioned that my experience started with FMCG, P&G, Unilever. As you would know, some of these big consumer companies heavily depend on sari-sari stores for their sales. In fact, most categories in FMCG would still experience roughly, between 50 to 70% of category sales happening in sari-sari stores. But the challenge is, even though collectively these stores are massive, individually they're just too small, and so it's very hard for companies to directly sell to them because their order sizes are very small and very, very unsustainable for them to serve them. And then for sari stores, if they have to replenish their products, they have to, close their shop, commute, carry heavy items, pay expensive prices, and do it kind of all over again multiple times a week, because they simply don't have enough capital to buy, a week's worth or a month's worth of inventory. So what Grocery aims to do, or it's doing, is to consolidate the supply chain by connecting um, more than 70 companies now, FMCG companies in our platform, directly to sari stores by giving sari stores an ordering app. And through the app, they can order directly through us, and we buy from all these 70 companies. We do the picking, the packing, the logistics, and we deliver it to the stores directly. Um, and therefore, we're able to give companies very powerful data for the first time, and we're able to give sari stores convenience and better pricing. Um, as you would imagine, building this type of business can be quite cumbersome because, number one, you don't have access to suppliers or good prices. And being a startup, we were able to partner with several retailer companies, Super 8, Robinson Supermarket, JG Summit being an investor, has allowed us to have an audience with the big FMCG companies, be able to negotiate margins, be able to leverage their logistics infrastructure. And that gave us several years of advantage in terms of accelerating our growth, which would not have happened if we don't work with big companies. So I do think that if there's an opportunity and there's a strategic alliance, it will definitely help startup companies. That particular experience allowed us to significantly reduce our burn rate because we have a fairly efficient supply chain and sourcing. It accelerated our credibility to the suppliers because we are endorsed by partners that they've been working with for decades now. And definitely helped unit economics, which helped the company survive the pandemic because of having very solid financials during a difficult economic time. Um, and as we kind of grow the platform, we started to do more fintech e-service type products. So as we've established a distribution network, we've started to give back to the ecosystem because now we have over 50,000 stores that we are able to reach multiple times a week. We've started to partner with companies like Bayad Center, for example, wherein we opened up all our 50,000 stores to Bayad Center to make it a bills payment point. And so effectively, we opened up their branch network to 50,000 stores with just a connection of the API. We worked with companies like GCash, for example, where GCash customers can go to a sari store to be able to cash in, tap up their GCash wallet and effectively give the cash to sari stores, which in turn we collect. And so in effect, our infrastructure is now helping cash collect for companies like GCash and other fintech companies. And so because of the scale that we've built, we're now, and because of the cost structure that we've been able to design, many things that we do end up being cheaper than if companies tend to do it themselves. So we're able to kind of now create value for everyone who wants to enjoy the ecosystem that they've also kind of helped us build. So I'm a believer of the synergies between big companies and startups. Grocery is definitely a company that has lived that, and I'm looking forward to have a very fruitful discussion with the rest of the panel to deep dive on this topic more.
Thank you so much, ER, and congratulations on the growth of Grocery over the past few years. Now, I'd like to invite our panelists back on screen for our Q&A and our panel discussion. So, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here. Great to see you guys. So I'd like to keep this section of our session free-flowing. So I'm going to be directing some of these questions to specific speakers here in the panel, but please feel free to jump in at any point with any insights or comments that you might have. So just literally butt in whenever you have a thought. So to set the stage for our discussion today, this is a question for the entire panel, but perhaps we can start with John. From your experience, what role do enterprises and conglomerates play in championing innovation? So traditional thinkers maybe see startups as competition, but that's clearly a dated mindset, as you described. So what benefits do groups like yours get from collaborating with these startups?
Well, I guess for the first thing, what you did say about innovation, and really, part of our culture here at the SM Supermalls is really about innovation. But looking now into the startups, as I mentioned, first there's really that thing in our DNA, we started as a startup, so we know exactly how it is to be a startup and how to grow from being a startup. So what the SM Supermalls does is that it basically provides these startups with the not only the opportunity but with a stage, particularly that allows them to succeed. Right. We have also moved into several things like omni-channel, wherein we have our SM malls online. So there are also other avenues by which we're able to help these particular startups not only on ground but even with our with our online apps, right? From SML's online to that of the one of the SM store, and so it is really providing that stage, particularly for them to be able to succeed, right? And to be able to see, particularly how how still being on ground, how still being in brick and mortar actually works very well here in the Philippines. Some of our earlier startups are doing in the startup market are doing very well actually right now.
And just piggybacking off that, in covering the startup community as a journalist, we're seeing a massive resurgence in F&B in brick and mortar. Places that maybe shrunk over the past 2 years because of the pandemic are resurging in a really fascinating way. I'm curious if Xavier and ER, you guys have any insights here as well.
Yeah, definitely. Let me just jump in. So with the Philinvest Group, I think like ever since the start, pandemic or not, right? We've had the sense that we would always play a big role in the startup ecosystem. We have a large ecosystem ourselves, right? And ER actually talked a little bit about this earlier. So one of the key ways, in terms of us working with startups, is us providing this huge platform for startups to push their products or services, right? So we essentially help them with their go-to-market, distribution, or even, in a sense, product development, right? So we have several examples of this. So for example, one of the startups that we've been working with is Investry from Indonesia. So they're the leading, SME financing platform in their market. And when they wanted to expand here to the Philippines, we immediately provided that ecosystem of businesses that they can offer their solutions to, right? So that's immediately available. So we just needed to develop processes, practices to integrate to the startups offering. Another example is we worked with a startup serving the hospitality and hotel business as well to develop a new solution, a new product that took them from just being a loyalty platform to one that offers more e-commerce products at scale, right? So many examples. I think on the flip side, on the part of the startup, I think what they have really brought to our businesses is this a culture and mindset on how to attack digital opportunities and move fast in this, accelerated digital future. A lot of enterprise organizations are obviously slower, right? Because they have existing processes and ways of working that are apt to optimize their existing businesses, but not necessarily to capture entirely new opportunities, right? So by working with startups, like our businesses, our people get to learn things and practices that startups do, like daily stand-ups, focus on UX, customer-centric design thinking, this notion of two pizza teams, etc. So hopefully a lot of these practices and learnings can also translate to, more mechanisms and new behaviors internally.
I'm a big fan of I think that was that Amazon. They're in their two pizza team concept. ER. So you touched on a couple of things earlier, actually. Credibility, funding, operations, unit economics. Perhaps we can expound a bit here on that bridging work that you do at Grocery, connecting Sari Sari stores with partners at scale, achieving those economies of scale, and then also building that data-rich environment you mentioned among Sari Sari stores, which is incredible. As you continue to expand your offerings, what role do these collaborations with conglomerate partners play in the growth of Grocery?
Very, very big, because in a developing market like Philippines, the type of startup ideas that we typically work on here are still linked to very, very, very important questions around, big problems of the country: efficiency, logistics, um, as opposed to, let's say, in a developed market in Silicon Valley. A lot of the startups there tend to also, create new demand, let's say Web3, the new dating app or things like that. Those are also very valuable things to do, but in a developed market setting. In a developing market setting, there's enough problems to solve. And anytime you do something like that, you need the participation of the incumbents, because they're the ones who are basically running the industries at the moment, right? The efficiencies and the value the technology brings into the table is something that will benefit everyone. Um, to Xavier's point earlier, what startups are able to bring in is the ability to fail, because obviously they're not big. Financially, the risk is not that much. And so the amount of prototyping, iterating, pivoting, um, gives the industry space to learn. But in the process, at some point, it has to connect to the existing players, because the existing players hold majority of the value at this stage, right? So, for example, um, when you want to get into fintech, you want to get into distribution, most of the suppliers are already fairly established. So there's also an opportunity for startups to determine and define how do you create an infrastructure where everyone can kind of enjoy the efficiencies of technology, right? And the more we're able to bring in big companies and small companies alike, in kind of the new world order, I think ultimately that's going to benefit the customers more, right? They'll have more options. I think gone are the days where we have to think that startups and big companies are competing. I think ultimately there are enough channels to be present in. Mr. Joaquin mentioned how brick and mortar has exploded, and there's definitely a role for brick and mortar channels. There's definitely a role for digital channels. There's definitely a role um, for direct consumer channels. And all of these will have its own opportunities to optimize. So I think startups allow us to rethink how we do things, challenge a bit the status quo. But I think net, if we're able to design something that's sustainable, I think everyone in the ecosystem will benefit. For us, right? I think to answering your specific question, Tiago, um, that because we're building a cash collection infrastructure that is driven by our delivery ecosystem, We don't have to be just collecting our cash, right? I gave the example of Gcash earlier, and any other wallet that wants to come and work with us, because we've already created a capability, an efficient capability to collect cash. We can cash collect for everyone. We can cash collect for distributors who are not necessarily who are selling to the same sari stores but may have some pain points on effective cash collection. We can share our the data of our sari stores to banks if they have a better credit scoring mechanism than ours, so that they can provide a much better financing product to our customers. But that still runs off of the data that we're able to create. So I think if you think that one entity is the best person to do everything, I think that's gonna be very deadly in terms of the growth of the organization.
Absolutely. Maybe I can pivot this towards Savior. As a venture studio, FDev offers a really cool model for co-creation, right? So this whole relationship of conglomerate ecosystems and innovation-focused ventures is quite literally built into your value prop, right? As a group. So that same expertise, I'm sure you bring into your work with Endeavor Philippines and Plug and Play, just bridging conglomerate partners and startup innovators. Could you expound a bit more on the journey of a startup coming up in a venture builder environment versus that of other startups, maybe who don't?
Mm. Right. So interesting, right? So again, when you look at the venture space and venture building space, I think you're looking at several different models, right? There are permutations on the model depending on the market, the opportunities, etc. But when you're looking at a venture idea, a startup coming out of a studio, again, it depends on whether the studio is like, attached to a corporate like ours, and we have that huge ecosystem, or an independent um, studio startup, right? I think we as a corporate backed studio, we have a bit more challenges in terms of I think attracting the uh, potential co-founders that will work on the startups. Essentially, what we do is incubate and work on the idea ourselves, probably for the first 3 to 6 months until it reaches a certain level of traction by leveraging the resources, the customers, the ecosystem that we have internally. And then once we have those proof points, we get additional team members in who are also passionate about that space, about the problem that we're solving, so that they can help further scale it up and then take it outside of our own ecosystem and include more ecosystems as well, right? And that's the situation where the startups would also try to tap the venture capital markets, right? So we see ourselves as that like angel investor at the beginning, to get the startup from 0 to 1, essentially, and then after that phase, we would get the team to scale it up further, increase valuation, increase customers, etc.
Fascinating and fantastic. And John, I actually wanted to throw this to you now. You mentioned earlier the rebounding role of brick and mortar that you see within your group, within your community, your ecosystem. What potential areas do you see for large businesses and startups to collaborate with and boost one another, especially as the economy moves further into this new normal?
Well, okay. I think one of the things that we've seen and why we call it a collaboration is that over the pandemic, I think maybe ER and Xavier may agree with this, is that you saw a lot of entrepreneurs really coming up, right? You saw a lot of new concepts, a lot of interesting new concepts, whether they are totally new or they offer something different from what you would normally see already in the malls, right? So that particular thing was, we basically collaborated with them, particularly to give these new ones, these startups or these new concepts, particularly that opportunity to come in. We gave them the assistance, we gave them particularly the marketing support to be able to ensure that they are properly seen, they are the foot traffic will be there with them. But in return, it gives us a new concept, right? It gives us a budding new concept or a budding new player in our malls that hopefully will grow. And as you can see, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, they actually grew from a kiosk and now are already moving or graduating into inline stores. So it is a collaboration. It is a win-win situation, particularly for both, right? In the case of the startup, I know before they would be, a bit hesitant because coming into the malls, obviously there will be certain financial charges that they need to pay. But then the company sees that and offered this particular startup market that gave them really preferential rent plus the additional support to ensure that to really make it a partnership because it's something that we look at long term.
Absolutely. ER, Xavier, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think absolutely, I completely agree that especially during the pandemic, I think the number of new ideas that came up became exponential, right? Because people were navigating through new normal, and every time there's a change, there's always opportunities for new ideas. And of course, we're absolutely grateful for companies like SM Supermalls and Philibest Group that they actually provide such environment for some of these new ideas to at least have a chance, right? Especially in the pandemic environment where everything is a lot tougher to execute. Having some of these support and help definitely means a lot to entrepreneurs. And what we do hope, right, is that in that pandemic environment, I'm sure we that also helped SM in a way, experiment new things, as Johnson said, test new ideas. What we're hoping is that this continues, right, even after pandemic, that this sort of collaboration between new concepts, established businesses, startups, big companies, will continue to, collaboration continue so that we can kind of look for new and better ways to serve our common customers. But I agree.
Yeah, yeah. Just to add, right? I think there are just so many like opportunities for collaboration, right? You actually won't run out of ideas. I, I think not just during the pandemic, although the pandemic obviously accelerated a lot of opportunities, but if you look at the Philippine market, right, and if you compare us with other like markets in the region, you'll see that there are tons and tons of like infrastructure gaps in the Philippines, right? And this is from a financial services perspective. This is from a logistics perspective. You can also look at it in terms of access to more affordable health care, education as well. So there are lots of things that corporates and startups can actually work on together. In terms of just specific areas, right? Well, we'll name a couple. To me, like one is still financial services, right? So I've been in fintech the last several years, and probably except for a couple of banks, I haven't really seen banks work with fintech startups a lot. But to me, fintech is just 1% done in the Philippines, right? Majority of the country is still massively underbanked or underserved from a financial services standpoint. Consumers are still not happy with their banking experiences today. There are still no APIs, for example, to go around to enable open finance, etc. Right? So I think this is one big area of opportunity that startups and corporates, specifically banks, right, can work together on because fintech touches each and every sector, right? From real estate to transportation to e-commerce, etc. Probably the second big area, from my perspective, is my hope is a lot of startups can really show disruption, or start disrupting very traditional industry sectors in the Philippines. For example, logistics, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, construction. I think we have a lot of these in the Philippines that are still very manual and paper based, right? So I think the opportunity is just so wide open.
Absolutely. Generally speaking, startups do thrive in relatively independent environments, right? So they require the freedom to explore partnerships and pivot as needed. So to an extent, as we've seen in the pandemic, lean times sort of make even more innovative solutions. So how do you thread the needle of ensuring that these startups get that freedom while still benefiting from working within and, of course, bringing value to conglomerate ecosystems? Or maybe is that even a consideration at all? It's just a question for the group.
I think it's an important question, right? Because the implication of what you're asking, Tiago, is why is this not happening more, right? At the end of the day, if you all recognize that this is an opportunity, we should see more. And yet, it seems like we're not. I think I can speak on the side of the startup, and maybe the gentleman can speak on their behalf. But obviously, from a startup founder's perspective, there is fear, right? Whether when you approach a big company, that you might lose control very early, or that you get outmuscled in a management situation, which is a normal expectation because everyone will have to look out for the interest of their individual organization. That's perfectly normal, right? I think what my advice to the founders is to be very clear about what they need and what they don't need, because there are, 100. If you can list down the value add that any big company can give you, that list could be very, very long. But if you really filter what are those one or two things that will unlock your growth, right? It could be, access to their customers, access to their data, access to their supply chain, access to their suppliers, or whatever that is. Then don't be afraid to put a premium on that, but don't also be afraid to be very confident about what you think you can do better. Just because you're more agile, you're able to take risks more, and hopefully you bring that to the table when discussing, how to split value and how to share profits and all, or even like in an investment situation. So there's nothing wrong that these conversations do happen, but I do feel like there's a perception that big companies will take over. In my experience, I don't think big companies necessarily want to do that because number one, and again, the gentleman can correct me if I'm wrong. They also want to learn, right? And if the company is too early, they don't want to run it. Especially if arguably the founder probably knows more about the business at that point. So just be bold, right? And define what you need and go ask for the help. And also be comfortable to say no if you think that the deal doesn't work for you. But I think a conversation should at least be a starting point always.
So, ER or John, maybe you guys have anything to add about threading that needle?
Well, actually, from our point of view, maybe looking at it from the standpoint of, let's say, the big corporate, right? It's really also realizing the being big. Okay, one of the things about being big is that you have to be very responsible, right? You have to take a look at where you came from and take a look at the communities that we serve, right? And that's always at the heart of the SM Supermalls. And I think one of the things is that there was a responsibility to really take a look at this during the time of the pandemic and looking at the opportunities that happened, particularly with the new startups. It was something that we really took to heart, right? And basically reached out particularly and gave special concessions in order to be able to invite these particular concepts into the mall, right? And the good thing about it is that it was really a decision particularly of management. Right now we're only in 13 of the bigger malls, right, and we have 79 nationwide. Not only that, we're expanding into other areas of the country, right? We're expanding into Sorsogon. We will be in another one in Tuguegarao and another one in Cavite soon, within the year. And I think that the good thing also about looking at it that way is that as we go deeper into the country or in new territories, we're able to discover actually and able to bring up into the state into a particular stage, right? These really unique type of businesses, right? And again, as I've mentioned, it's really a win-win situation for both, right? It's not only a one-way thing for us, but it's also something that the startup gets to be able to show their what they can do, particularly on a big scale, and basically expand even more.
Fantastic point.
Yeah, probably just to reinforce what John and ER mentioned, right? I think from the corporate's perspective, right, we all have to think that we cannot do everything ourselves, right? And we definitely need the help of other players, especially in this space, digital technology, where it's not the core competency of large enterprises today, right? So I think corporates in general like are already very much open to working with startups, but they also have to um, develop ways to learn more about what's out there and how they can actually source these startups, right? On sourcing and partnering with startups, I think one of the key points here is that while corporate and startup collaborations can provide a lot of opportunity, right? It's still very hard to do, right? Definitely not something like very easy to accomplish. And there are many potential challenges, right, that both startups and corporates have to face. I think on one side, the pace of the startup is extremely fast, and the pace of the corporate is a bit slow. So there's always, I think, this healthy tension, right? You'll probably end up somewhere in the middle, and that's okay. But for corporates and innovation teams, I think they have to be pulling more towards the pace of the startup themselves. And for the startups at the same time, they have to be a bit more patient like with the teams from the corporates that they're working with. I think the other point from a corporate standpoint is there are just so many potential opportunities out there, right? So there's a tendency for like a corporate to try out a lot of things and work with several startups. So you end up with a lot of POCs or a lot of pilots, so to speak. There's actually like a meme about this, like from one big global company that said that they have more pilots than Lufthansa Airlines, right? So it's gonna be really hard to execute on like, all these ideas, right? If you work on so many, so it's important to focus, I think. So if you have multiple initiatives, it's important to prioritize and just work with your leaders on the parameters of a startup partnership. What will actually be achieved by the partnership? Who will do what? What are your KPIs, right? And to ER's point earlier, both sides have to really know what their objectives are for the partnership. For the startup, you can't work with all the corporates, right? Not everyone is for you. Same thing with on the enterprise side.
Absolutely. I actually think this is a great a great segue to a question we got in from our Facebook viewers. Question asker asks, we've seen that Philippine startups are resilient and some are even growing bigger due to the pandemic. But what else do you think that the private sector and the government should address in order for the for new unicorns to thrive here in the Philippines?
Yeah, just to jump in, my short answer to that is in a for a startup ecosystem to develop, you need access to market, access to capital, and also access to talent, right? So I think those three things are extremely important. I think with corporates, they provide more of that access to new channels in the market, right, for startups. But like, to be honest, there is that huge gap when it comes to access to capital and access to talent. So I think those two are the things that we need to work on more.
Yep. I think completely agree with what Xavier shared. What I'll add to that is most startup founders when they begin their journey, they're just trying to prove out if the idea is even worth investing further. But in those stages, they already have to worry about compliance, many paperwork, regulatory, which are all legal stuff and that needs to be done. But there are models in different markets where there's a lot of relief in the first few years of a company when it comes to some of these things, just to kind of help out. Because in reality, even if that the risk of the opportunity lost for the government for being absolutely tight on those companies will be very small because the company value is going to be very little anyway in the first few years. So anything that could help give the founder some flexibility to test, try out new things without having to worry about, do I have the right permit for this type of a pilot, will really help. And of course, just make sure the rules are very clear that, beyond a certain size, you have to do it. But in the beginning, as much freedom as possible would be super helpful.
Well, actually, yeah, thank you, Xavier and ER. You covered practically, but looking at it from a different perspective, like let's say working with the government units, particularly, we have a lot of situations wherein, let's say, with the DTI, right, or yes, with the DTI, wherein we allow for them to come into the malls, particularly to hold bazaars and exhibits, right, and from there, actually, you're really giving that collaboration between the super malls and the DTI gives that that particular startup or that particular small MSME an opportunity to shine, right? An opportunity to see, even just to basically experiment whether being in a mall is something that they would want to do. So I think it's what Xavier had said is the access also to talent, right, or the access to new concepts. And we do get a lot of new concepts, particularly in our tie-ups with the government units.
Fantastic points. It's almost creating like a microcosm of all the different factors right there inside the super malls. Before we end today's session, I'd like to invite each of our speakers to share some final words with our audience. Perhaps we can start with ER, and then Xavier, and then John. John, you have the final word here. So ER.
I think my mic is muted, sorry. I think just to kind of stay within the core topic of today's discussion, my message would be to encourage, as I mentioned earlier, the the founder side of the fence, to not to not hesitate and explore if there are any strategic partnerships that you can do with specific companies that can truly help unlock your growth, right? I think the market has definitely matured. Um, in my experience, working with big companies, suppliers, partners, the intention is for kind of co-collaboration and mutual growth is there. the finer things on how to make that work, as Xavier would say, may not always be as clear. It's not something that's very easy to iron out because of existing systems, politics, entrenched business models. But that's why you're a startup. You're there to steer things up. So, and it's tougher to steer a bigger pot than it is to steer a small pot. But nonetheless, I encourage that conversation to happen. And the second point is I still believe that there are enough big problems that the country could benefit from startups. And startup companies cannot do those or solve those alone. We would need the help of people who have some expertise in the industry, who have the right connections, who have the right experience. Bring them in as advisors, bring them in as investors as needed. And that's going to kind of help, remove blockers for you as a company. But as a final point, make sure that you're absolutely clear about what you need and what's your objective, so that you don't have to necessarily put yourself in a position where you might be giving away unnecessary value if you don't need it. So that also needs to be something you control. But I hope definitely that this partnership between small businesses, startups, and big companies continue to flourish over the next few years. I think the country needs it. Yeah, and thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. Xavier?
Thanks, Thiago. Thanks as well for the opportunity. And let me quickly touch on collaboration and open innovation in these final words, right? So I think the startup ecosystem in the Philippines has been growing for sure, especially in the past couple of years. But if you compare us with other markets in the region, again, we're still relatively far behind in terms of the number of startups, as well as the level of support that are devoted for these startups. So again, we need more access to markets, access to capital, talent, infrastructure, even connectivity, right? And I think there's this saying: it takes a village to raise a child, and this holds very true for the very nascent startup ecosystem in the Philippines. So this requires a lot of open collaboration between different types of organizations, big enterprises, small businesses, government, non-government, even local and foreign, right? Educational institutions, banks, HR firms, marketing agencies, events companies, you name it, right? So I think all these players, all these stakeholders, all need to work together. I think, especially for the corporate side, if you look at innovation and startups, right? I think they're not just about new technologies or new business models. It is also all about new ways of working together. And this is the digital age, and technology today is built on philosophies of openness, democratization, etc. So I think organizations, especially large organizations, really have to shift more towards these behaviors of, open collaboration, transparency, experimentation, and empowerment as well, to really help move the startup ecosystem forward, but at the same time also help them in their own digital transformation and innovation journey. So I mean, it's my final guidance for this morning. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. And John, you have the final say of the panel.
Okay. First of all, Thiago, and to Business World, thank you very much for inviting the SM Supermalls to be part of this. Maybe I just wanted to say that looking at it really as a partnership, particularly between, as I've already mentioned several times today, the partnership between the bigger corporates and the startup is something that we should really try to encourage, or really encourage in the country today, right? For one, as we are moving, hopefully already on the right track to moving out of the pandemic, right? It's also one way in order to be able to spruce up again, or basically start up again the whole economy, right? And what better way than to really get entrepreneurs, particularly, to start to come up and to be able to grow, right? So partnership in the sense that, from the startups point of view, it's their willingness, particularly to experiment, to risk, particularly to go onto a bigger stage from where they are today. And from the standpoint of the corporates, is as Iard mentioned, is really to get out of their mold, right? To get out of to think out of the box, particularly, and be able to take a look at certain models, right, that may be able to work, particularly with these startups. And as mentioned, in the end, we do believe that it will be mutually beneficial to everyone.
Fantastic place to end today's discussion. So thank you once again to our panelists, John, San Agustin, Xavier, Marsan, Rolian. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you all today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good morning.
Okay. You too. Bye.
Now, I'd also like to thank P&A Grant Thornton for supporting this session. A huge thank you as well to our partners, the British Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Management Association of the Philippines, the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and of course our media partner, the Philippine Star. And to everyone who joined today's discussion, thank you. Please join us again in the next sessions of Business World Insights. You can follow Business World online to be updated on our webinars and other projects. Again, my name is Santiago Arnaiz. Maraming salamat. Thank you very, very much. And I'll see you all again in the next session of Business World Insights. Good afternoon.